Bennington triangle, as everybody probably knows, which is not, as one person asked me recently, a kind of musical instrument at all. The term was actually coined by Joe Citro, who lives up in Burlington, and besides being Vermont's answer to Stephen King, he is also one of the predominant folklorists for all New England, and he coined it back in 1992 to describe kind of not one thing in particular, but a cluster of strange things that all seem to happen in a certain nexus area. And I picked up about 3 years ago researching where he left off, and have found even more below the surface, plenty of strangeness. This area, I haven't proved it statistically or anything, but I've been researching weird things for plenty of years, and there seems to be more in this county than any equivalent population county in New England. There's been monsters, UFOs, disappearances, vampire slayings, a witch trial, poltergeist, and Shirley Jackson. So, Glastonbury Mountain is usually thought of as being kind of center of the triangle, maybe not geographically, but thematically. There's an old legend that as far back as centuries ago, the native tribes in the area regarded the mountain as cursed and stayed away from it. We don't have a whole lot of historical data on what really went on with the Native Americans in this area, but we do know that as soon as they settled a town on the mountain, it didn't do very well. It seemed to be kind of ill-fated from the beginning. It was settled late in the 17th century. It was incorporated as a town in the 1830s. But even before that, the early censuses show a constant overturn of families, and people didn't stay very long in the early days. There was bad epidemics. They had whooping cough and diphtheria, and generally the high altitude and a lot of built-in factors made it a problematic place for farming or just subsisting on. So, but they did thrive for a little while in the 19th century. They had a bit of an industry converting timber into charcoal for iron smelting, and they got by on that until late into the 19th century when the mountain was pretty well clear-cut, and that dried up. There was a brief effort to use it as a resort area. There was a lot of money dumped into what was called South Glastonbury to create kind of a picturesque environment for tourists to come from all around, and that looked as though it was going to do well for about one season, and then flooding wiped out the tract, and that was more or less the end of that. And so Glastonbury, the town, kind of evaporated, and there's been a lot of speculation about whether that was due to normal factors or whether that was the curse on the land. And the most talked about aspect of the Bennington Triangle legend is usually the disappearances, which actually the very first fairly famous disappearance in the county was back in 1812 in Manchester. A guy named Russell Colvin was last seen engaged in an argument with his two brother-in-laws, Stephen and Jesse Bourne, and he, according to their account, stormed off and didn't come back. And Russell was not terribly well liked in town, and he had a penchant for going off for weeks and months at a time. So no one thought a whole lot about it until about 7 years later. So they got a late start looking for him. But 7 years later, the uncle of his two brother-in-laws, Amos Bourne, who was a fairly well-respected member of the community, started coming forward with dreams that he was seeing Russell's ghost in the night, and started talking about that, and then all of a sudden, lots of people in Manchester started seeing Russell's ghost in their dreams, and here and there, and that, in those days, that was a pretty strong indictment of wrongdoing. Ghost testimony it was kind of like the King of Hamlet, Hamlet's dad on Denmark. It was a big deal, and so they indicted the Warrens for his murder, and they were convicted really quickly, and about to be hanged when all of a sudden word came that Russell was alive and living in New York, and had been seen by a former Manchester resident who was relocated to New York, and at great expense they got Russell to come back, and he was here for several days, and everyone from his wife to his children, who had been quite young when he left, and all the townspeople who knew him, said, you know, this is in fact him, and obviously there's been no murder. So the Warrens were released, and about as soon as they got released, they took off west, and Russell went back to New York, and nobody ever heard about him again. And very shortly after, people had started having reservations and doubts about who it was they actually talked to. They didn't have any at the time, but shortly after, people started wondering if maybe somebody had found a look-alike and trained them and then versed them on his